Now, since we are talking about exchange rate, one other thing that you need to understand is, what is the connection between exchange rate and the price? Well, let's go back to the story I was telling you earlier. Okay? Suppose exchange rate depreciate. What happens is that the price of import goes up, right? Theoretically, textbook says if the price of import goes up, we reduce our import because import becoming more expensive. But as I said, in real world, in the case of Indonesia, we cannot do that. We need those import. Unfortunately now, the price of that import goes up. So if the price of the import goes, let's say you're producing textile, okay? And then you need the coloring, you need some cotton, and all those are imported, okay? And suppose the price of color, the price of cotton increase. You cannot reduce that import because if you reduce, you cannot produce your textile. So you maintain the volume of the import of the color and the cotton, but now you have to pay higher price. That means the total value of import goes up, right? Now, if that is the case, then this is what they call imported inflation. Meaning what? Meaning the price, because inflation is basically price increase, right? So imported inflation is a condition whereby the price increase because of the increase in the price of import. And we cannot avoid that. Even though the price of import goes up, we continue to import. Because if we don't, we cannot produce. Okay? So that is the concept of imported inflation. So now, maybe this is the first time you see in our class the first relation between exchange rate and price. So I hope you're ready to answer whenever we ask in the exam. Explain what's the relation between exchange rate and the price. So this is it. Okay. Now, coming back to your question earlier, can you, I don't have the list of the students. What is the name of that student who asked the question, why if we want to increase output, we have to have a trade deficit?
It's me, sir. Ingrid.
Okay. Now, coming back to your question here, suppose you don't like that because you don't like if there is an, if there is an increase in the output leads to widening deficit. So suppose that's the case, okay? How do you do that? How can you continue increase the export? Remember this, the first story is increase of export, right? So earlier the story is that you increase export, you increase output, but then at the same time you increase the trade deficit. So how can you avoid trade deficit from that story? So this is the story here. So when export increase, okay, then output increase from Y to Y prime, right? But instead of you let the trade deficit widen, okay, you depreciate the currency. You see what I mean? Or you reduce the spending, the government spending. So in other words, when export increase, remember this export, okay, from ZZ to CC prime, okay, and your output potentially increase from Y to Y prime, but we know the story, if you increase Y to Y prime, trade deficit widen, and you don't want that, then you can reduce the Y prime to Y. How do you do that? Reduce the government spending. Okay, so this is the first example of what they call policy mix. So, what is the mixture? The mixture is, in this case, currency depreciation and reducing the government spending. So this is an example of policy mix here.
Hello, sir.
Correct. Yes.
Sir?
Yes, please.
I want to ask about, about the policy mix, can we imply or use another policy such as increasing tax rate to decrease the output from consumption?
Yes, absolutely. You can. Yeah. That's a good question because that means you still remember the first aggregate demand equation earlier, right? Anything that will reduce the output, that will work, and X will reduce the output, that will work. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So let's continue now. Now, I know some of you, can you raise your hand who is not majoring in economics? I mean, like majoring in accountancy or business. Okay, are you in accountancy or in business?
Counting.
Accounting. So no one from the business, from the management?
Nope.
No one, okay. All right, well, you know, even though this course is about macroeconomics, I think it is important for you to understand also what is the impact of all the story that we just talked. What is the impact on the business community? What does it mean for the business sector here? Okay. Now, take for example the case of exchange rate. Suppose rupiah weaken. That's like depreciation, right? What happened? Well, depending on what business are you in. Suppose you are an exporter. Then if rupiah weaken, it's good news for you, right? Because your export will go up. But remember the story about I cannot export if I don't produce, and I cannot produce if I don't import. So basically the impact of exchange rate depreciation on the exporters are big question mark. It can be positive, but it can be negative, depending on what kind of export business are you in. If you are exporting goods that is 100% domestic product and you don't use any import, then exchange rate depreciation is good for you. But if your business involves a lot of import, then it may not be good for you. So that's one impact of the exchange rate depreciation on the business. Now suppose you are not in a business of exporter, but suppose you are in any business in which your business borrow loan in foreign currency, which is again, this is a good example in Indonesia at this moment because one of the weak spots in the Indonesian economy now is there's a lot of corporate debt in foreign currency. Okay, so suppose you are all in that position. Now, how many? Well, students from accountancy knows very well about balance sheet, but those who are in economics, just imagine balance sheet. It's like a P account. Okay, so on the left hand side is the asset, on the right hand side is the liabilities, right? So if your company balance sheet is in such that on the liability side, there's a lot of loan in foreign currency. Let's say you're borrowing $1 million. So on your liability, there's $1 million there. Okay? Now, of course, because your operation is in Indonesia, you have to translate that $1 million into rupiah. So suppose the course, the exchange rate is 13,500. So that means 13,500 times 1 million. Okay? 13,500 million rupiah. Okay? Because your balance sheet is in rupiah, not in US dollar. But you borrow $1 million. Okay? Now imagine what happens if the exchange rate depreciates. You are not adding your loan, you still borrow $1 million, but now when you translate it into rupiah, that value will explode, right? Suppose the exchange rate depreciate from 13,500 to 16,000. Then all of a sudden, if you look at the balance sheet, your debt, which is $1 million, now in rupiah exploded. And that means, because debt is a debt, right? Debt is okay and it's good. What is not good is when you have to pay, right? So when you have a debt, that amount, you have to prepare the amount of money that you need to pay, right? So if the rupiah value of your debt increase, then you have to prepare more money for payment. And if you set aside that amount of money, that means there will be less amount of money available for your expansion, for your business. So that means for that kind of business, the effect of the exchange rate depreciation is negative. Okay? What about if you are bank? So you are not producing, but you are intermediating money, because the role of bank is basically intermediation, right? What about if you are a bank? Okay. Well, again, let's use the case of Indonesia. In most banks in Indonesia, if you look at the asset side of the liability, there's one big component, which is government bonds. You know the story in government bonds, right? So Indonesian government issue bond. I think they call it surat utang negara. Okay, so who are the biggest buyers? The biggest buyers are banks. So Indonesian banks, they love buying government bonds. Okay, because the interest rate is pretty high, 7%. I mean, these days, most of the world interest rate is very low, and I think I mentioned last week, there are 7 countries even adopted negative interest rate. But Indonesia is 6%. Wow, that's pretty high. That's the reasons why banks in Indonesia love to keep that money. And that bond is in the asset side, right? Because bond is like a paper with the writing I owe you. In this case, I is the government, so the government owes to the bank, and that's why it's becoming the asset of the bank, right? Now, you have to understand the concept of bonds here, because soon is a bond, right? The concept of bonds is pretty simple. The price of bond is inversely related with the yield of the bond. So in other words, suppose the yield goes up, then the price of the bond goes down, and vice versa. If the price of the bonds goes up, then the yield will go down. Is that clear? Okay. Now, if, let's say, suppose your bank on the asset side is holding 1 million rupiah of bonds, government bonds. That's on the asset side, right? 1 million rupiah. Now, suppose the yield of the bond, so the yield of the government bond, suppose it goes up. The interest rate, for example, goes up. Then the yield of the bond goes up. Then the price of that bond will go down. So if that happens, then on your asset, which is originally 1 million rupiah of government bonds, now that value is less than 1 million. Okay? Maybe 700,000. Because, remember, yield and the price of the bonds are inversely related. So, this is the one important point that you learn today. Okay? And unfortunately, this is not discussed in the textbook. Okay? And this is an example. Remember last week I mentioned, unfortunately, we still use a textbook which is written by, someone who don't live in Indonesia, who's, in different countries. That's why for Indonesian students, I personally think you need to understand this, because this is really what's going on in Indonesia. So if you are a bank in Indonesia and you're holding a lot of government bonds, every time the interest rate goes up, that is not only affecting investment, credit, and consumption. I think most people knows about that. If interest rate goes up, then credits will go down. But there is one other thing, one other mechanism which hits the bank, and that is it worsens your balance sheet, because the asset value of your balance sheet will go down. Okay, just because the government raised the interest rate, and the mechanism works through the government bonds value goes down. So those are the three lines of impact of the story we were discussing earlier. That is the story of exchange rate, inflation, and interest rate, right? And I just explained to you what are the impact on the business community here. Oh, this is just the story of the balance sheet effect that I explained to you earlier. Remember, if you're a company and then you borrow, I don't know, I forgot to mention, I think I mentioned about $1 million, right? So that $1 million will be here, will be on your liability side. Here. Okay? But then if the exchange rate depreciates, that $1 million have to be multiplied by bigger amount of rupiah. And that is bad for the balance sheet. That is a bad news for the company here, basically. So this is just the chart.